The air in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado carries a different weight in early autumn. It's a crisp, crystalline promise of the coming winter, a stillness that can feel both serene and deeply isolating. For 28-year-old Ethan Hayes, an avid and experienced rock climber, this was the cathedral where he felt most alive. On the morning of September 14, 2005, he drove his worn-out blue pickup truck to the trailhead of what he called his personal Everest, the treacherous north face of Spectre Peak. He was chasing the last of the season's good weather, a final, solitary ascent before the snows would seal the mountains away until the following summer. His mother, Eleanor Hayes, remembers the last phone call with a painful clarity that has not faded with time. His voice was filled with a vibrant energy, the kind he only ever had when talking about the climb ahead. He promised it was a route he knew well, that he would be safe, and that he'd call her from the summit. She can still hear the faint crackle of the reception and the distant call of a hawk in the background, a sound that has haunted her dreams for 2 decades. "Be careful, my boy," she'd said, her voice a familiar chorus of maternal worry. "The mountains will always be there. Make sure you are too." Ethan's plan was straightforward, a 2-day climb with a bivouac on a well-known ledge halfway up the face. He was meticulous in his preparations, a trait that made his disappearance all the more baffling to those who knew him. His backpack was loaded with high-energy food, water, and emergency gear. His ropes and carabiners were top of the line, checked and rechecked with the precision of a surgeon. He was not a daredevil. He was a craftsman, and the rock was his medium. As he signed the trail register, a simple Ethan Hayes, the 14th of September North Face, he was confident, prepared, and utterly unaware that he was writing his own epitaph. The first sign that something was wrong was the silence. By the evening of September 16th, no call had come. Eleanor, clutching her phone, paced the floor of her quiet suburban home in Boulder, her anxiety growing with every passing hour. She told herself he was probably just out of range, that he'd decided to spend an extra night, that there were a dozen logical explanations, but a cold knot of dread was tightening in her stomach. Ethan was responsible. He was considerate. He would have found a way to call, to let her know he was okay. By the next morning, panic had set in. Eleanor's frantic calls to the Whispering Pines County Sheriff's Department were initially met with standard reassurances. Climbers often ran late, they said. Weather could change, plans could shift. But as she described Ethan's unwavering reliability and the unforgiving nature of Spectre Peak, the tone of the dispatcher shifted. The wheels of a search and rescue operation began to turn, slowly at first, then with gathering urgency as the scale of the situation became terrifyingly clear. The initial search party found his truck exactly where he'd left it, at the trailhead. Inside, a half-eaten bag of sunflower seeds sat on the passenger seat, and a worn map of the area was tucked into the door pocket, a red line marking his intended route. The sight of the vehicle, so normal and still, sent a chill through the nascent search team. It was a silent testament to a journey that had begun but had not yet ended. The man had simply stepped out of the truck and into the vast, indifferent wilderness, leaving everything else behind. Sheriff Jim Brody, a veteran of countless mountain rescues, felt the familiar weight of a race against time. The weather forecast was turning, with a major snowstorm predicted to hit the high country within 48 hours. "If he's up there and he's hurt," Brody stated in a later interview, his voice heavy, "we're running out of daylight in more ways than one." The immensity of Spectre Peak loomed over them, a sheer granite monolith that seemed to mock their efforts. Finding a single man in that vertical labyrinth would be like finding a needle in a stack of needles. Family and friends gathered at the trailhead, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and fear. They brought coffee and food for the volunteers, their hands trembling as they pointed at maps, trying to trace Ethan's possible path with their fingers. His best friend, Liam, also a climber, stared up at the rock face, his own expertise offering no comfort, only a deeper understanding of the thousand things that could have gone wrong. The wind was picking up, whispering through the pines, carrying with it a chilling premonition. The first day of the search yielded nothing. Helicopter crews scanned the endless granite walls, their rotors beating a desperate rhythm against the mountainside, but saw no sign of Ethan's brightly colored climbing gear. Ground teams navigated treacherous scree fields and dense forests. At the base of the peak, their calls of his name swallowed by the sheer scale of the landscape. As dusk fell, a cold, hard rain began to fall, a prelude to the coming snow. hope began to feel like a fragile, flickering candle in a gathering storm. Eleanor Hayes stood at the edge of the search perimeter, her husband's arm wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the darkening peak. She couldn't feel the cold or the rain, only a hollowing emptiness that was vast and terrifying. She whispered her son's name into the wind, a desperate, futile plea to the silent mountain. The mystery had begun, etched into the granite of Spectre Peak and the hearts of those who loved him. The snow was coming, threatening to bury any and all clues, to entomb the secret of what had happened to Ethan Hayes for years to come. The snow arrived exactly as predicted, a thick, smothering blanket of white that descended upon the San Juan Mountains with relentless force. It effectively ended the official search for Ethan Hayes. For 3 frantic days, search and rescue teams had battled deteriorating conditions, their efforts becoming increasingly desperate and dangerous. The helicopters were grounded, and the ground crews were forced to retreat as avalanche risks escalated to critical levels. The mountain had sealed itself off, taking Ethan's fate as its own guarded secret. Sheriff Jim Brody had to make the call no one wanted to hear. At a somber press conference held in a stuffy room at the county courthouse, he announced the suspension of the active search. He spoke of the impossible conditions, the safety of the volunteers, and the grim reality that the window for a rescue had closed. He promised the search would resume if new leads emerged or when the snows receded in the spring. But everyone in the room understood the unspoken truth. This was no longer a rescue mission. It was now a recovery, and the odds of that were shrinking with every snowflake that fell. The investigation, led by a young and ambitious detective Marcus Thorne, shifted from the mountain to the life Ethan had left behind. Thorne and his team began the painstaking process of interviewing family, friends, and acquaintances, trying to build a picture of the man and uncover any reason why he might have disappeared. They learned of his meticulous nature, his passion for the outdoors, and his general lack of any known enemies. He was, by all accounts, a kind, driven young man with a bright future. The narrative of his life held no dark chapters, no hidden demons that might explain a voluntary disappearance. Yet, a small point of friction did emerge during the interviews. His climbing partner and occasional rival, Leo Gallo, seemed unusually tense. He spoke of Ethan with respect, but there was an undercurrent of competition in his words, a hint of a professional jealousy that was common in their high-stakes world. Leo's alibi for the days Ethan was on the mountain was solid. He was working at his construction job 2 towns over. But Detective Thorne made a note in the file, a small, nagging question mark next to Leo's name. It was nothing concrete, just the gut feeling of a cop who sensed something was being left unsaid. As the weeks turned into months, the case grew colder. The initial flurry of media attention faded, replaced by other headlines, other tragedies. For the Hayes family, however, time did not move on. Their home became a shrine to their missing son, his room left untouched, his photos a constant, painful reminder of the gaping hole in their lives. Ethan's father, David, a quiet and pragmatic engineer, poured his grief into a different kind of investigation, spending his weekends hiking the lower trails of Spectre Peak, searching for any sign, any piece of discarded gear that the official teams might have missed. The spring thaw brought a renewed sense of hope, but it was a hope tinged with dread. The Whispering Pines County Sheriff's Department, true to its word, organized a limited-scale search of the lower elevations as the snowpack retreated. They focused on avalanche debris fields and creek beds, places where the mountain might give up what it had taken. They found nothing, not a scrap of clothing, not a broken piece of equipment, not a single clue to suggest where Ethan's final moments had occurred. The mountain remained silent. Detective Thorne kept the case file on his desk long after it was officially moved to the inactive cabinet. He would periodically reread his notes, going over the interviews, the maps, the targets. Any evidence was, in itself, unsettling. Experienced climbers sometimes fell, succumbing to accidents or the elements. But in those cases, some trace was almost always found eventually. A frayed rope, a dislodged piece of protection, a backpack. Ethan Hayes had vanished from the face of the earth as if he had simply evaporated into the thin mountain air. For Eleanor and David Hayes, the not knowing became a unique form of torture. An accident was a tragedy they could, in time, learn to accept. But the open-ended mystery left no room for closure, no final resting place for their grief. Every knock on the door, every ringing phone, carried the potential for news. a potential that slowly eroded their peace over the years. They were trapped in a liminal space between hope and despair, a quiet purgatory created by the silence of a single, indifferent mountain. Years passed. Sheriff Brody retired, and Detective Thorne, now a seasoned veteran, was promoted to captain. The Ethan Hayes case file following him, a ghost in his filing cabinet. New climbers came to Spectre Peak, some aware of the legend of the vanished climber, others oblivious to the tragedy held within its rock and ice. The story became a piece of local lore, a cautionary tale whispered in climbing shops and breweries. The acute pain of the initial disappearance slowly settled into a chronic, indelible scar on the community. On the 15th anniversary of Ethan's disappearance, a small article appeared in the local paper. It recounted the story, featured a photo of a smiling, sun-kissed Ethan, and included a brief, heartbreaking quote from his mother. "We still hope," Eleanor had said, her voice fragile but resolute. "We just want to bring him home." But as the years continued to pile up, that hope became an increasingly heavy burden to carry, and the silence from Spectre Peak seemed more profound and permanent than ever. 2 decades is a lifetime. For the Hayes family, it was a period measured not in years, but in missed milestones. Birthdays passed without celebration, holidays were hollowed out observances, and the joy of family gatherings was always tempered by a conspicuous absence. David and Eleanor grew older, their hair turning gray, their movements slower, their grief settling deep into their bones. The vibrant home that once echoed with Ethan's laughter and energy became a quiet, still place, a museum of memory where time seemed to have stopped in September of 2005. David Hayes never stopped searching. His annual pilgrimage to the Spectre Peak trailhead became a solemn ritual. He would park in the same lot, walk the same initial stretch of trail, and stare up at the unyielding granite face. He was no longer looking for his son to come walking out of the woods. He was searching for a sign, for a piece of the puzzle, for a reason. He spoke to new generations of park rangers and sheriff's deputies, his story a familiar, tragic piece of local history. They would listen patiently, offer their condolences, but there was nothing new they could ever tell him. In the Whispering Pines County Sheriff's Department, the Ethan Hayes file was officially a cold case, a thick manila folder filled with faded reports and grainy photographs. It was a training case for new detectives, a lesson in how a person could simply cease to exist. Captain Marcus Thorne would occasionally pull it from the archives, the crisp pages now soft and worn at the edges. He'd trace the lines of Ethan's planned route on the map, the ghost of his initial investigation still haunting him. It was the one case that had truly gotten under his skin, the one loose end he could never tie off. The world outside of the Hayes' grief moved on. Technology surged forward in ways that would have seemed like science fiction in 2005. GPS technology became pinpoint accurate, drone capabilities exploded, and forensic science developed tools that could extract DNA from the faintest of traces. These advancements, however, offered little comfort. They were tools that required something to analyze, a scene to process, a body to examine. They were useless against the sheer, overwhelming absence of evidence in Ethan's case. The mountain held its secrets locked away in a fortress of rock and ice. Liam Gallo, Ethan's former climbing partner, built a successful life for himself. He married, had children, and his construction company grew to be one of the most respected in the region. But the shadow of Ethan's disappearance never fully left him. In a small town, memories are long, and whispers can linger for years. He always felt the sideways glances, the unasked questions. He had cooperated fully with the investigation, had answered every question, but he knew that in the minds of some, a sliver of suspicion would always remain. He learned to live with it, but it was a heavy, invisible weight. The changing climate began to have a noticeable effect on the Colorado Rockies. Winters became shorter, summers hotter and drier. Glaciers that had been stable for centuries began to recede at an alarming rate. Scientists and park rangers documented the changes, noting the emergence of landscapes and geological features that had been buried under ice for generations. It was a topic of concern for environmentalists and hydrologists, a slow-motion crisis unfolding in the high country. No one yet connected this gradual global phenomenon with a 2-decade-old local mystery. As the 20th anniversary of Ethan's disappearance approached, a freelance journalist began work on a true crime podcast about the case. She read the Hayes family, and now retired Sheriff Brody, and even managed to get a reluctant comment from Liam Gallo. she hoped to shed new light on the story, to perhaps jog someone's memory. The podcast brought a brief resurgence of interest in the case, but ultimately, it retold a story with no ending, a narrative that led to the same cold, silent place, the base of Spectre Peak. Eleanor Hayes found a measure of peace in tending her garden. She poured her frustrated maternal energy into the soil, nurturing life from the earth. Each spring, as her flowers bloomed, she would think of Ethan and the mountains he loved. She began to see the mountains not as a malevolent force that had stolen her son, but as his final resting place, a grand, wild cathedral that held him in its embrace. It was a fragile piece, but it was better than the raw, open wound of the early years. She was learning to live with the silence, but the mountain was not as static as it seemed. High up on Spectre Peak, in a remote and nearly inaccessible cirque on the north side, something was happening. For 20 years, a deep, permanent snowfield had filled the steep gully, its ice compacted over seasons into a formidable glacier. But the recent succession of unusually warm springs and hot summers was doing what 2 decades of searching could not. The ancient ice was beginning to melt, pulling back from the rock and revealing what it had held, undisturbed, for so long. On a brilliant sun-drenched afternoon in late May of 2025, the thaw reached its tipping point. Water trickled in rivulets down the granite slabs, pooling and carving new channels through the melting snow. The edge of the snowfield had retreated by more than 30 vertical feet from its position a few years prior. A splash of faded red nylon, buried for 20 years, was finally exposed to the Colorado sun. The silence of 2 decades was about to be broken by the quiet, persistent drip of melting snow. The hiker's name was Chloe, a geology student from the University of Colorado Boulder, in the mountains for a summer project. She was not on any official trail. Her goal was to study glacial retreat, and she had specifically chosen the remote northern cirques of Spectre Peak for her research. Using satellite imagery to identify areas of significant recent snowmelt, she was methodical and cautious, equipped with an ice axe and crampons, navigating the treacherous, unstable terrain with practiced skill. The air was thin and cold, but the sun was intensely bright, reflecting off the remaining snow with a blinding glare. She was documenting the edge of the receding snowfield when she first saw it. From a distance, it looked like a piece of trash, a frustratingly common sight even in these remote areas. A flash of unnatural color of faded, dirty red against a dark outcropping of rock that had clearly been covered by ice until very recently. Annoyed that someone would have littered in such a pristine place, she carefully made her way closer, intending to pack it out. As she got within a few yards, she realized it wasn't a simple piece of trash. It was fabric, and it was attached to something. Her heart began to pound against her ribs, the sound suddenly loud in the alpine silence. The red fabric was the tattered remnant of a backpack, its material shredded and worn by years of grinding ice. Protruding from the snowmelt and loose scree beneath it was what looked unmistakably like a weathered leather hiking boot. It was old, the style dating back decades. Chloe froze, her scientific curiosity instantly replaced by a primal sense of dread. She knew the stories. Every local knew the story of the climber who had vanished on this very peak. She fumbled for her satellite messenger, her fingers numb and clumsy, not from the cold, but from adrenaline. Her signal was weak, bouncing off the sheer granite walls of the cirque, but after several agonizing attempts, the confirmation light blinked green. Her message was simple, her thumbs shaking as she typed: found possible human remains. North Cirque, Spectre Peak, sending coordinates. She stood up and backed away slowly, her eyes fixed on the boot, as if it might move. The sheer immensity of the wilderness pressed in on her, and for the first time that day, she felt utterly and completely alone. The message was received at the Whispering Pines County Dispatch Center, and it set off a chain reaction that reached all the way to Captain Marcus Thorne's office. He was in a meeting, but the dispatcher knew the significance of the location, and interrupted him. As Thorne read the message on his phone, the pass came rushing back with the force of an avalanche. Spectre Peak, human remains. After 20 years, the words he had long given up on hearing were finally there, in stark, digital text. He felt a jolt, a mixture of grim satisfaction and profound sadness. Organizing the recovery mission was a complex logistical challenge. The location Chloe had pinpointed was high, remote, and dangerous. A standard helicopter landing was impossible. The county sheriff, a woman named Elena Ramirez, coordinated with the state's Alpine rescue team. They would need a specialized crew, technicians who could be lowered by long line from a hovering helicopter. It was a slow, delicate operation that couldn't be rushed. The weather was clear for now, but in the Rockies, that could change in an instant. Detective Sarah Jenkins, the department's lead cold case investigator, was assigned the case. She was sharp, empathetic, and had a deep respect for the forensic science that had evolved so dramatically since 2005. She immediately pulled the original Ethan Hayes file, its contents now digitized but still bearing the marks of Thorne's original investigation. She read through the initial reports, the witness statements, the timeline of the failed search. She was stepping into a story that was already 20 years old, a ghost that had haunted her captain for his entire career. The first call Thorne made was to a quiet, tree-lined street in Boulder. David Hayes answered on the second ring. Thorne identified himself, his voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Hayes," he said, taking a slow breath. "We've received a report. A hiker has found something on Spectre Peak. We believe it may be Ethan." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line, broken only by a sharp, ragged intake of breath. David didn't speak for nearly a minute, and when he did, his voice was a choked whisper. As the recovery team prepared their gear, a sense of solemn purpose settled over the operation. This was not just a recovery of remains. It was the recovery of a story, of an answer that a family had been waiting 2 decades to hear. Detective Jenkins flew with the team, her role to observe and ensure the scene was processed as a potential crime scene, not just an accidental death. Until they knew otherwise, every possibility had to be considered. As the helicopter lifted off, she looked down at the sprawling wilderness, a landscape that was finally beginning to speak. From the air, the scale of the mountain was breathtaking and intimidating. The pilot pointed out the gully Chloe had described, a deep scar in the mountain's north face. As they drew closer, Jenkins could see the small, colorful figures of the recovery team being lowered one by one onto the treacherous slope. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, their professionalism a stark contrast to the raw, chaotic nature of the landscape. Below them, nestled against the rock, was the faded red backpack, a silent beacon that had waited 20 years to be found. Thaw had begun, and the mountain's secrets were starting to surface. The recovery site was a scene of controlled, deliberate activities set against a backdrop of immense, raw nature. The Alpine rescue team had secured the area, setting up anchors and safety lines on the steep, unstable slope of scree and melting ice. The air was thin, and every movement was an effort. Detective Sarah Jenkins watched as the forensic team, clad in specialized cold-weather gear, began the painstaking process of excavating the site. They worked with the precision of archaeologists, understanding that the ice and rock had preserved a scene that had been untouched for 2 decades. The remains were partially scrutinized, but remarkably well preserved by the deep, consistent cold of the snowpack. The coroner, who had been flown in with the team, could make an initial identification based on the circumstances. The dental records would be needed for official confirmation. Found with the body were the remnants of what was clearly climbing gear. A faded blue harness, a chalk bag still containing a block of chalk, and a set of cams and nuts on a gear sling. Everything was consistent with a climber from that era. It was Ethan Hayes. There was little doubt in anyone's mind. The team documented every item with meticulous care before moving it. The tattered red backpack was carefully opened. Inside, its contents were a time capsule from 2005, a waterlogged journal, its ink mostly illegible, several high-energy food wrappers, a small first aid kit, and a disposable camera, a relic from another age. Jenkins felt a pang of empathy, imagining the young man packing these items, full of hope and anticipation for the climb ahead, completely unaware this bag would become his tomb. As they worked, clearing away the loose rock and ice from around the body, one of the technicians paused. "Detective," he called out, his voice slightly muffled by his hood. "You should see this." He pointed to the climbing rope. One end was still tied securely to the harness on the remains. The other end, however, which should have led up the mountain, was lying coiled just a few feet away. It wasn't attached to an anchor. It wasn't broken from a fall. As the technician held it up, Jenkins could see it clearly. The end was not frayed or snapped. It was a clean, unmistakable cut. A sudden, intense chill ran through Detective Jenkins, a cold that had nothing to do with the alpine air. An accident was a tragedy. A fall was a known risk of the sport. But a cut rope that was not an accident. That was an act of malice. This discovery instantly transformed the scene from a sad recovery mission into an active and complex homicide. Investigation. The Silent Mountain was not just the site of a tragic accident. It was a 20-year-old crime scene. The mood of the team shifted palpably. Every piece of evidence was now viewed through a new lens of suspicion. They widened the search grid, meticulously scanning the surrounding gully. They were looking for anything that seemed out of place, anything that didn't belong to a solo climber. The work was slow and arduous. The high altitude and the precarious footing made every step a risk. But the revelation of the cut rope fueled them with a new and determined energy. They weren't just bringing a lost climber home anymore. They were hunting for a killer. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the granite peaks, another discovery was made. Tucked deep in a crevice of the rock wall, about 10 feet from the body, and partially concealed by a loose rock, was a small, tarnished object. It was a silver locket, heart-shaped and blackened with age. Jenkins carefully placed it in an evidence bag. It was delicate, feminine, and seemed utterly out of place with the rugged, masculine climbing gear. It didn't feel like something that would belong to a climber like Ethan Hayes. The discovery of the locket was another sharp turn in a story already full of them. Whose was it? How did it get here, in this impossibly remote location? Jenkins held the small evidence bag in her gloved hand, the weight of it feeling far heavier than it should. It was a deeply personal item, a tangible link to an unknown person and an unknown story. It was a piece that didn't fit the puzzle of Ethan Hayes, the solo climber. It suggested someone else had been on that mountain. As the recovery team prepared to airlift the last of the evidence and the remains from the site, Jenkins took a final look at the gully. The sun was casting long, dark shadows across the rock, making the cirque look even more menacing and vast. The scene was now clear of all but their footprints, but the echoes of what happened here felt louder than ever. The cut rope and the silver locket were not just clues, they were voices, speaking from the ice after 20 years of forced silence. Back in her office late that night, Jenkins placed the evidence bags on her desk. The disposable camera was sent to a specialized lab, in the faint hope that some images might be salvageable. The cut rope was sent for forensic analysis, and the locket sat on her desk, a small, silver question mark. She opened the cold case file for Ethan Hayes and began a new page of notes. The case was no longer cold. It was active, it was complex, and it was rooted in a secret that someone had believed would remain buried forever. The first order of business for Detective Sarah Jenkins was to officially inform the Hayes family. She and Captain Thorne drove to Boulder themselves, choosing to deliver the news in person rather than over the phone. They found David and Eleanor in their garden, the same garden Eleanor had tended for 2 decades as a substitute for her grief. When they saw the official car and the somber faces of the officers, they knew. The confirmation that it was Ethan was both a crushing weight and a profound relief, an end to the agonizing uncertainty. But then Jenkins had to tell them about the rope, explaining that Ethan's death was not an accident, but a likely homicide, was like inflicting a second, even crueler wound. The image they had constructed of a tragic fall, a peaceful end in the mountains he loved, was shattered and replaced by something sinister and violent. Eleanor let out a soft cry, her hand flying to her mouth, while David's face, already etched with grief, hardened into a mask of cold fury. The questions they had lived with for 20 years were suddenly replaced by new, more terrible ones. Who would do this to their son, and why? Back at the department, Jenkins immersed herself in the original 2005 investigation file. She felt a strange connection to the younger detective Marcus Thorne, who had written the reports. His frustration and his lingering suspicions were palpable in the clipped professional prose. She saw the note he had made about Liam Gallo, the climbing rival, and the slight inconsistencies in his timeline that were never fully resolved. At the time, with no body and no evidence of foul play, there had been no grounds to push him harder. Now, everything had changed. Jenkins knew she needed to talk to Thorne, not as her captain, but as the original investigator. She found him in his office, staring out the window, the Spectre Peak case file open on his desk. He looked older than his years, the weight of this resurrected ghost apparent on his shoulders. "Talk to me about Liam Gallo," she said, sitting down opposite him. "Your gut was telling you something back then." I want to know what it was. Thorne leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant as he dredged up the memories. Liam was slick, he began, choosing his words carefully. He had an answer for everything, almost too perfect. His alibi checked out on paper time cards from his job site, a foreman who backed him up. But his emotional response felt off. He was more agitated than grieving. He kept talking about how he was the better climber, how Ethan took unnecessary risks. It felt like he was trying to distance himself, to subtly place blame on the victim. Thorne recounted a specific detail from his 2005 interview with Gallo. When asked about Ethan's relationships, Liam had been dismissive, saying Ethan was married to the mountains, that he didn't have time for serious relationships. It seemed like a minor point at the time, but now, with the discovery of the delicate silver locket, it felt like a potential deception. A locket is a lover's gift. If Ethan had a secret girlfriend, it was a part of his life that Liam had either not known about or had deliberately concealed. Jenkins listened intently, her own investigative instincts aligning with Thorne's 20-year-old hunch. The case was no longer just about a cut rope. It was about secrets. She decided her next step had to be a visit to Liam Gallo. He was no longer the young, cocky climber from the old photos. He was a pillar of the community, a family man, a successful business owner. Approaching him would be delicate. He would be defensive, and he would have a lot to lose. Before she went to see Gallo, Jenkins took another look at the tarnished silver locket. It was old, but with careful cleaning, a small inscription on the back might be legible. She sent it to the forensic lab with a specific request: handle with care, and see if there are any initials or dates. She also checked the original witness list, looking for any mention of a girlfriend, any female friends who were particularly close to Ethan. There were a few names, but nothing that stood out. The ghost of the investigation was beginning to take shape, pointing toward a secret life Ethan had led. The lab called back sooner than she expected. The disposable camera was a bust, too damaged by moisture and time, but they had managed to carefully clean the locket. Under the tarnish, engraved in a delicate script on the back, were two sets of initials, intertwined with a date, EH and AV, and the date, August 14, 2005, exactly 1 month before Ethan disappeared. AV Jenkins cross-referenced the initials with her witness lists and local records from the time. It took a few hours, but then she found it. AV stood for Amelia Vance, a young woman who had worked at the same outdoor gear shop as Ethan. The ghost of the investigation was no longer a vague suspicion. It now had a name. The discovery of the locket and the initials opened up an entirely new avenue of inquiry, one that had been completely missed in 2005. The narrative of Ethan S.'s solitary monk of the mountains was wrong. He had a secret, and Jenkins had a strong feeling that the secret was at the very heart of why his rope was cut. Armed with Thorne's old hunches and this new tangible piece of evidence, Jenkins felt the tumblers of the cold case begin to click into place. The path was becoming clearer. It led through a secret romance and directly to the front door of Liam Gallo, the man who claimed Ethan had no time for love. She picked up her keys, a sense of grim determination settling over her. It was time to see if Mr. Gallo's memory had improved over the last 20 years. Liam Gallo lived in a large, modern home on the outskirts of town, a testament to the success he had built for himself over the past 2 decades. The man who answered the door was grayer and heavier than the one in the 2005 file photos, but the same confident, almost arrogant, set of his jaw was unmistakable. He was initially cordial when he saw Detective Jenkins and Captain Thorne, but his smile tightened when they asked if they could come inside to talk about Ethan Hayes. The past had just walked up his stone driveway and was standing on his welcome mat. They sat in his pristine living room, a space filled with tasteful art and photos of his smiling wife and children. Liam maintained a practiced composure, offering his condolences to the Hayes family and expressing his shock that it might have been foul play. He recounted his story from 2005 with practiced ease, his alibi still smooth and seemingly unshakable. He was at work, he said. His crew could vouch for him. He spoke of Ethan with a detached, almost clinical respect, the same way he had 20 years ago. Jenkins let him talk, observing his body language, the way he avoided direct eye contact when he mentioned Ethan's name. She then slid a small evidence bag across the polished coffee table. Inside, the cleaned silver locket gleamed under the recessed lighting. "We found this with Ethan's body," she said, her voice even and calm. The inscription on the back reads EHNAV. Does the name Amelia Vance mean anything to you, Mr. Gallo? The reaction was instantaneous and profound. A flicker of panic crossed Liam's eyes, a barely perceptible tightening of the muscles in his jaw. For the first time, his smooth facade cracked. He looked at the locket, then back at Jenkins, and for a moment he seemed to be at a complete loss for words. Amelia, he stammered, recovering quickly but not quickly enough. I might remember that name. I think she worked with us at the gear shop for a summer. I didn't know she and Ethan were involved. The denial was too quick, the feigned surprise too theatrical. Thorne, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward. That's interesting, Liam, he said, his voice laced with the weariness of a man who has heard too many lies. Because when I interviewed you in 2005, you were adamant that Ethan wasn't seeing anyone. You said he was married to the mountains. That seems like a pretty significant detail to forget, especially if you all worked together. Thorne's presence, the living link to the original lie, seemed to rattle Liam even more than the locket itself. Jenkins pressed the advantage. We spoke with your foreman from 2005, he said, a calculated bluff. He confirmed you were at the job site the day Ethan started his climb. But he also mentioned you clocked out early that afternoon, said you were sick. Liam's face paled. It was a detail buried deep in the old files, a minor note that had seemed insignificant at the time. Now, it was a crack in the foundation of his 20-year-old alibi. I had a migraine, he said quickly. It was nothing, but it was something. Leaving work early gave him a window of several hours that afternoon, more than enough time to drive to the Spectre Peak trailhead and hike up to the lower sections of the North Face. Enough time for a confrontation. Jenkins and Thorne didn't need to say it out loud. The implication hung heavy and suffocating in the air of that perfect living room. The carefully constructed narrative of Liam's life was beginning to unravel. At the seams, the detective's next visit was to Amelia Vance. They found her not in Colorado, but in Oregon, where she now worked as a landscape architect. She was a woman in her late 40s, her face lined with a quiet sadness. When they told her they had found Ethan, she began to weep silently. A grief she had carried alone for 20 years finally allowed to surface. She confirmed that she and Ethan had been deeply in love, and that they had kept their relationship a secret. When asked why, her answer was simple and chilling: because of Liam. Amelia recounted a story of a toxic love triangle. She explained that she had initially dated Liam Gallo, but his possessiveness and jealousy had pushed her away. She then fell in love with Ethan, who was kind and gentle. When Liam found out, he was enraged. He saw it as a betrayal on two fronts, Amelia said, her voice trembling. Ethan was his climbing partner, his biggest rival. In his mind, Ethan had stolen both the woman he wanted and the spotlight he craved. She told them about a heated argument she had witnessed between the two men just days before Ethan's final climb. It was about climbing, about a disputed first ascent. But the real venom, she said, was about her. Liam had threatened Ethan, telling him to stay off his mountain. She had begged Ethan not to go on his solo climb, filled with a terrible sense of foreboding. He had insisted he needed to clear his head in the place he felt most at peace. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place when Jenkins asked Amelia about the day Ethan disappeared. Liam called me that evening, she said, her eyes wide with the dawning horror of the memory. He was trying to sound casual, asking if I'd heard from Ethan. He said he was worried about him up on the mountain alone. At the time, I thought it was strange. Now I think he was checking. He was checking to see if his secret was still safe. The unraveling was nearly complete. Liam Gallo's alibi was no longer about a verified time card. It was about a window of unaccounted-for time. His motive was no longer a vague professional jealousy. It was a specific and powerful rage born of personal betrayal. And his strange behavior after the disappearance was no longer just odd. It was the calculated action of a man trying to confirm he had gotten away with murder. All that was left was the final, forensic proof from the rope itself. The forensic report on the climbing rope landed on Detective Jenkins' desk like a closing argument. The lab had used a powerful scanning electron microscope to analyze the fibers at the point of the cut. Their conclusion was unequivocal. The rope had not been severed by rubbing against a sharp rock or by the strain of a fall. The fibers were sliced cleanly, with microscopic striations consistent with a single, deliberate cut from a serrated blade. They even identified the likely type of tool, a small, partially serrated knife, the kind commonly included on wood chores, popular with climbers. That this physical evidence was the nail in the coffin of any lingering theory of an accident. It transformed the mountain of circumstantial evidence that jealousy, the secret relationship, the broken alibi into a solid foundation for a murder charge. The story was no longer just about what Amelia Vance had said, or what Marcus Thorne had suspected. It was written in the very fibers of the rope that was supposed to have been Ethan Hayes' lifeline. The mountain of lies Liam Gallo had built over 2 decades was about to come crashing down. Jenkins and Thorne briefed the district attorney. The case was complex due to the passage of time, but the new evidence was compelling. The DA agreed, giving them the green light to bring Liam in for a final, formal interrogation. The focus was now on systematically dismantling his story, piece by piece, leaving him with no option but the truth. They prepared a detailed timeline, cross-referencing Amelia's testimony with Liam's known movements and the forensic findings. The narrative of what likely happened on Spectre Peak in September 2005 became terrifyingly clear, fueled by a potent cocktail of jealousy and rage. Liam had left work early. He knew Ethan's route, knew his plan to bivouac on a specific ledge. He had hiked up the easier, non-technical approach to a point above that ledge, waiting for Ethan to arrive. He had confronted him there, high on the lonely rock face, far from any possible witnesses. The argument that had started in town escalated into a final, fatal confrontation. The motive was clear. If he couldn't have Amelia, neither could Ethan. If he felt overshadowed by Ethan's climbing prowess, he would permanently remove his rival. It was a crime of passion, disguised as a mountaineering accident, and concealed for 20 years by a blanket of snow and a wall of lies. The silver locket, which Ethan must have been carrying to give to Amelia upon his return, was likely dropped during the struggle, a tiny, glittering witness to the crime that fell into a crevice, hidden until the ice finally gave it up. Jenkins found herself haunted by the image of Ethan on that ledge. He would have been tired from the day's climb, settling in for the night, feeling that sense of peace and accomplishment he always sought in the mountains. He would have been completely blindsided. The appearance of his rival, his supposed friend, in that isolated place would have been shocking enough. The realization of his murderous intent would have been a horror beyond comprehension. The betrayal was as deep and cold as the ice that would soon entomb him. The investigators also had to consider the psychological toll on Liam Gallo. For 20 years, he had lived with this secret. He had built a life, a family, a successful business, all on a foundation of murder. Every spring when the snows melted, he must have felt a pang of fear. Every time Ethan's name was mentioned, he must have felt the ghost of his crime. His carefully controlled life was a prison of his own making. The constant need to maintain the lie, a form of self-inflicted torture. Before bringing Liam in, Jenkins made one more call to Amelia Vance. She asked her about Liam's gear, specifically his knife. Amelia remembered it clearly. He was so proud of it, she recalled. A high-end multi-tool with a half-serrated blade. He was never without it. He used to say it could cut through anything. Her words sent a chill down Jenkins' spine. The description matched the forensic report perfectly. The stage was set for the final act. The evidence was aligned, the motive was established, and the witnesses, both living and long silent, were ready to speak. The team prepared the interrogation room, a sterile, unwelcoming space that stood in stark contrast to Liam Gallo's opulent home. There would be no comfortable chairs or tasteful art here. There would only be the truth. Waiting in the harsh fluorescent light, the mountain of lies had stood for 2 decades, as imposing and seemingly permanent as Spectre Peak itself. But like the glacier that had hidden Ethan's body, it was built on a foundation that was slowly melting away under the relentless heat of the investigation. One final push was all that was needed to trigger the avalanche and reveal the ugly truth buried at its core. The time for questions was over. It was time for answers. The final interrogation of Liam Gallo did not begin with accusations. It began quietly. Detective Jenkins and Captain Thorne sat opposite him at a stark metal table. On the table between them lay 3 evidence bags, the cut rope, the silver locket, and a photograph of a smiling Ethan Hayes. For several long minutes, no one spoke. The silence in the small room was a weapon, heavy with the weight of 20 years of secrets. Liam stared at the table, his confident demeanor gone, replaced by a weary tension. Jenkins started by walking him through his original statement from 2005. She spoke in a calm, neutral tone, reciting his own words back to him. The alibi at the construction site, the claim that Ethan was a loner, the feigned concern for his friend's safety. With each sentence, she laid another brick in the wall of his original lie, forcing him to look at its construction. Liam's answers were clipped, monosyllabic. Yes, that's what I said. That's correct. Then, Thorne took over, his voice resonating with the authority of the past. He spoke of his own doubts from 20 years ago, the gut feeling that something was wrong. He wasn't speaking as a captain anymore, but as the detective who had been haunted by this case. I knew you were lying, Liam, Thorne said, his voice low and intense. I didn't have the proof then, but I have it now. The mountain gave it to us. He pushed the forensic report on the cut rope across the table. The rope didn't break, you cut it. Liam stared at the report, his breathing becoming shallow. He shook his head, a weak, reflexive denial. No, that's not. It was an accident. He fell. Jenkins countered immediately, her voice sharp and precise. Then explain the locket, Liam. Explain Amelia Vance. Explain why you lied about their relationship. Explain why you told her you were worried about Ethan that night. Were you worried, or were you confirming that no one had heard from him? Confirming that you were in the clear? She laid out the entire narrative, her words painting a vivid, inescapable picture. The secret love affair, the jealous rage, the confrontation on the mountain ledge. She described the multi-tool with the serrated blade that he always carried. With each detail, another layer of Liam's composure was stripped away. His face, which had been a mask of careful control, began to crumble. A muscle in his cheek twitched uncontrollably. He was trapped in a web of facts, forensics, and memories. The turning point came when Jenkins slid the photo of Ethan across the table. He trusted you, she said, her voice softening slightly, not with sympathy, but with a profound sense of the tragedy. He was your friend. He was up there, in his favorite place in the world, and he would have never, ever suspected you. You didn't just take his life, Liam. You destroyed his family. You let them live in a hell of uncertainty for 20 years. A sob escaped Liam's throat, a raw, ugly sound that seemed to be pulled from the deepest part of him. The carefully constructed dam of denial finally broke, and the truth came flooding out in a torrent of guilt and confession. He began to speak, his voice thick with tears, the words tumbling over one another as he recounted the events of that September afternoon. It was all there, just as the investigators had pieced it together. The rage, the confrontation, the impulsive, irreversible act of violence. I didn't go up there to kill him, he choked out, his head in his hands. I just wanted to talk to him, to scare him. He told me it was over between him and Amelia, that he was going to choose her. He said I had lost. He looked so happy. In Liam's twisted perception, Ethan's happiness was a final taunt. In a moment of pure, blind rage, he had pulled out his multi-tool, opened the blade, and severed the rope that anchored Ethan to the rock face. He described the horrific moment that followed, the look of disbelief and terror in Ethan's eyes, the silent fall into the gully below. He recounted his panicked flight from the mountain, his frantic drive back home, the cold dread that set in as he realized what he had done. He had committed the perfect crime, concealed by the vastness of the wilderness and the coming snow. He had buried his secret, and then he had spent the next 20 years living on top of its grave. The confession went on for over an hour, a catharsis of poison that had been inside him for half his life. He told them everything, leaving no detail out. The relief of finally unburdening himself, warring with the crushing weight of his guilt. He had gotten away with it for so long that he had almost convinced himself the secret would die with him. But he had underestimated the persistence of a father's love, the dedication of investigators, and the slow, inevitable memory of the mountain itself. When he was finished, a profound silence once again filled the room. But this time, it was not a silence of secrets and tension. It was the silence of an ending. Liam Gallo, the successful businessman, the husband, the father, was gone. In his place sat a killer, his face streaked with tears, his future now a grim, foregone conclusion. The final brutal ascent of his crime was over. All that was left was the long fall down. The news of Liam Gallo's confession and arrest sent a shockwave through the community of Whispering Pines. The man they had known as a local success story, a family man, was revealed to have been harboring a monstrous secret. The resolution to the 20-year-old mystery of Ethan Hayes was not the closure many had expected. It was a fresh trauma, a revelation that evil could wear such a familiar, neighborly face. The story of the lost climber had finally found its ending, but it was a darker, more tragic tale than anyone had imagined. For David and Eleanor Hayes, the truth brought a complex and agonizing form of peace. The not knowing was over, but it was replaced by a horrific certainty. Their son had been murdered by someone he considered a friend. They attended every day of Liam Gallo's trial, sitting in the front row, their faces a portrait of quiet dignity and unbearable loss. They listened to the forensic evidence, to Amelia Vance's tearful testimony, and to the chilling playback of Liam's own confession. They were there to bear witness, to be the living memory of the son who could no longer speak for himself. Liam Gallo was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His successful life, his beautiful home, his family, it was all forfeit. The cost of a single rage-fueled moment on a mountain ledge 2 decades earlier. As he was led from the courtroom, he glanced towards David and Eleanor, his face a mask of shame and defeat. There was no apology he could offer that would bridge the chasm of what he had done. His punishment was not just the prison cell, but the life he would now have to live with the full, unvarnished truth of who he was. After the trial, the Hayes family was finally able to bring Ethan home. They held a memorial service not in a church, but at the Spectre Peak trailhead, the place where his final journey began. Hundreds of people attended, friends from his youth, fellow climbers, members of the search parties from both 2005 and 2025, and community members who had been touched by his story. They shared memories of Ethan's infectious energy, his kindness, and his profound love for the wild places of the world. Detective Sarah Jenkins and a retired Captain Marcus Thorne stood at the back of the crowd. For Jenkins, the case was a testament to the power of new technology and old-fashioned police work coming together. For Thorne, it was the closing of a painful chapter that had defined much of his career. He felt a sense of profound satisfaction, not of victory, but of a duty finally fulfilled. He had kept his promise to the Hayes family, even if it had taken 20 years to do so. David Hayes spoke last. He stood before the crowd, his voice thick with emotion but steady, and looked up at the immense peak that had held his son for so long. For 20 years, we looked at this mountain and felt only pain and questions. He said, we saw it as the thing that took our son. But the mountain didn't take him. A man did. The mountain just held him for us, until we were ready for the answer. It kept his secret safe, and then it gave him back. Today, this is not a place of loss. It is Ethan's final cathedral. Later that week, David and Eleanor made one last trip. This time alone, they hiked a short way up the trail and found a quiet spot overlooking a valley. There, they scattered Ethan's ashes, letting the Colorado wind carry him into the wild landscape he had loved more than any other. There were no more searches to be done, no more questions to be asked. There was only memory and the quiet, enduring love for their son. The silence from the mountain was no longer haunting. It was peaceful. The case of Ethan Hayes serves as a somber reminder of how quickly a life can change, how a moment of anger can create ripples of grief that extend for decades. It is a story of jealousy and betrayal, but also one of enduring love and the relentless pursuit of truth. The secrets men keep can be buried, but sometimes they are buried in places that are not meant to keep secrets forever. Sometimes they are simply waiting for the thaw. The snows will return to Spectre Peak this autumn, as they always do. They will cover the gully, the ledges, and the high granite walls in a pristine blanket of white. The mountain will once again fall silent, holding the memory of the climber who was lost and then found. But things are different now. The snow is no longer a symbol of a cold, unsolved mystery. It is a shroud of peace, a quiet finality. Where the snow settles, Ethan Hayes is finally at rest.